Good evening, everyone. My name is Mireya Piña, and today I will be talking about the impacts of the climate crisis on food supplies. This presentation looks at the impacts of human activity on climate change and its correlation with global food insecurity. New projections estimate that the world's population in the coming decades will have a catastrophic effect on natural resources while trying to provide basic needs such as food, clothing, and housing for everyone. Adapting to the global climate crisis by using innovative machinery to access natural resources comes at the expense of the environment and its regular course. Research reveals that there is a vicious cycle between population growth, food production, and its implications for the environment. The COVID-19 pandemic augmented food shortages and hunger experienced in many countries in the world, including the United States and Afghanistan. Community education, policy changes, and the implementation of environmentally conscious practices can reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to climate change and its effects on the global food chain. So here we're going to be looking at the human population and its increase over the past 50 to 70 years and where we're headed. So if we look here on the graph, we look at the 1950s, 1960s, there was about 3.5 billion people in the planet. Now, if we go on to 2020, we're at 7.8 billion. I know we're headed towards that 8 billion pretty soon, and it's expected to increase about 2 billion people by 2050. With the increase of population, there's going to be an increase in resources such as food, housing, care, waste, and energy. So we're going to take a look at industrialization since the beginning of the 1830s and a little bit of the different things that contribute to global warming, such as a production of vehicles, fast fashion, the production of energy, and other manufactured items that we use to build things. There is a lot of controversy because these people who lead certain large industrialized corporations, they're much of the ones who are often blamed, as they should be. So I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the individual footprints because this is a man-made issue. So I also will be touching on some weak policies ahead. So I'll be looking at the greenhouse gas emissions. So what are greenhouse gas emissions? They're gases that get produced when there are certain things trying to be produced, such as energy, pumping water, trying to access those natural resources, the burning of coal, fossil fuels. So what happens is that the heat gets trapped in the atmosphere, which then brings changes to weather patterns directly impacting crop productivity. So here's a list of where greenhouse gas emissions come from and what contributes to them. So if we take a look here, we can see how agriculture contributes 10%, commercial and residential, 13%, industry, 23%, electricity, 25%, and transportation, 29%. So if we take a look here, it's just, I wanted to highlight how industry, electricity, and transportation, those are all things that are often taken for granted. We are in a more developed culture, so we almost think these things are, we're entitled to them, but in reality, there are different strategies that we can implement in different areas to reduce the amount of use we use in order to not contribute to the global climate crisis, as it has detrimental impacts on our food supplies. So I'll go on to the next slide. So climate change and its impact on agriculture. So through the changing weather patterns, we see drastic changes, very diverse temperatures, intense heat waves, floodings, droughts, the storage of crops, an increase in bacteria in the crop, and shorter harvest. So these are all things that play a role in the quality of food supplies that different communities receive. So I did just want to talk about the droughts and the flooding that is related to water, and there are water shortages in the world. Here in California, according to one of the articles I read to support the information on this presentation, there is not enough water. Therefore, there's many desalination plants that are currently in place and more that are about to be approved to keep up with the water demand that we need to produce crops and other manufactured items. So with that being said, the desalinized water ultimately has an impact on the environment. That briny water ends up back onto the land, and that affects the soil and any kind of crop that might be trying to grow there, or if whatever ecosystem comes in touch with it, it is ultimately contaminating the earth. So those are some of the impacts that it has directly on agriculture. And I will talk a little bit about food shortages affecting communities disproportionately across the world. Afghanistan is facing half of their population is affected by food insecurity. And I put on here the social determinants of health because our social determinants directly impact the food we have access to. A lot of these countries don't directly have, a lot of things are imported to Afghanistan. Much of the United States is a large supplier for a lot of crops, and especially here in California and the Central Coast. It provides a lot of the crops for different countries, which also takes up 80% of the water that the state uses goes directly to agriculture. So food is an essential need, and of course that affects health. And the COVID-19 has also had a large impact on the food people are able to access. This given to the CDC guidelines where people maybe we stopped from working, so that meant that there were less food getting to stores. There's a drop in essential people that need to be, working so we can have the things that we can go get from the store. So the COVID-19 impacted a lot of families in different areas, a lot of kids here in the United States. Many people depend on school lunches to feed their families. And during this time, there were barriers that were in the way for people to access this essential need, such as food. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about individual footprints and community education. What I mean by that is, how do we individually contribute to climate change? It's important to remember that climate change is man-made. Therefore, we are able to make those individual changes, lifestyle changes, to ultimately change our behaviors. So here's some pictures of countries that face world hunger. There's also the picture of properly disposing of items. This plays a very large role into how much we ultimately help or damage the environment. And of course, on the right, we have community education. It's important to instill smart, environmentally conscious practices into our children who are in school. It's the perfect age. Studies show that the sooner they are taught, the more they can practice it, and it becomes almost like a second nature for them. And so it is a global it is a global crisis. We are seeing this in the United States. Hunger is everywhere. It impacts different communities differently. Some countries such as Afghanistan, other Southern Asian countries are also seeing the damages of climate change in real time. Here, I feel like we talk about global climate change as if it's very far off, but there's people already living it. So we need to do what we can as public health educators to educate ourselves and our communities so we can stall this to stall the where we're headed. So I'll go on to the next slide. A big policy, it's a treaty that got signed in 2015 and was in place in 2016 is the Paris Agreement. This was a treaty signed between many nations. It was 96 of them who are committed to taking the steps to not allow temperature to increase to Celsius, which would put us in a very dangerous position. And the nations are also committed to making necessary economic, social, and social transformations to meet the legal agreement among nations. So I think they're extending support to other countries who might not have the resources to really practice this new style of living, so we don't have to all live with world hunger. And here are the sources I used for the presentation, and thank you for listening.